Welcome to the Bible's Greatest Mysteries. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I'm Sharon Gilbert, and we are delighted to continue a discussion we began last week. And if you missed it, go back and watch it, because Aaron Judkins and Judd Burton have, I think, they've figured it out.
I think so too. This is really an exciting discovery. We're talking about their new book, Decoding Göbekli Tepe, Biblical Anatolia and the Watchers, the #1 Amazon new release in the archaeology category, and well-deserved, because I think they've come up with some conclusions that have not been previously found by the archaeologists in the 30-year history of studying Göbekli Tepe.
Well, 30 years is not nearly long enough. We need to have another 30 years. Just send those guys over there. And just turn them loose.
And I think it's important to remember that only a small percentage, only about 5% of the site has been excavated at this point, maybe 10%, but it's the vast majority of the site is still underneath the dirt.
And it was ritually buried. And there are others in the area, other tepes, other monuments that were ritually buried.
Yeah, stone hills like Karahan Tepe.
Arslan Tepe.
Arslan Tepe is an ancient site devoted, that was part of the Uruk culture. That's not in the stone.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a different location.
Wrong Tepe.
Yeah, Tepe just means hill. And actually,
like
Göbekli Tepe means potbelly hill because of the shape. But
it's a cutie.
It is. But there are 11 other sites in that vicinity that are called Tas Tepele, which means stone hills, and they all appear to be ritual sites, some of which indicate skull rituals and skulls that were not removed from willing donors.
Well, and there's one that has a whole central area that looks like it's devoted to fertility.
Fertility, yes, gentle way of putting it. Yeah, that would be Karahan Tepe. Yeah. Well, it is a fascinating discussion, and it is one that relates to the very early history of humanity. Probably very early in the post-flood era, not long after Noah and his sons descended from the boat and people began to repopulate the earth.
So this is about 9,000 BC?
9,000, 8,000 BC, somewhere in there. So that's roughly the age that scholars believe these sites fall into.
Is that based on pottery?
Well, no, because it's pre-pottery Neolithic.
Oh, well, there you go. So it's very difficult to give it an age then, isn't it?
Well, yeah. They have to look at other clues.
Like bones.
Bones, and they will do some carbon-14 dating, but when you get beyond about 1400 BC, carbon-14 is not really reliable.
I know. So that's why I say ish.
Yeah, so ish is the date. That is correct. But yes, we're talking about these massive sites with massive stone pillars and engravings that were moved without the use of the wheel. And again, this is in a pre-pottery Neolithic, pre-pottery Stone Age, basically. So very early. And this is why in last week's program, Dr. Judd Burton said that there was a 90-degree change in culture that appears to be reflected in what took place at Göbekli Tepe. In other words, an advanced civilization, like an angelic civilization, contacting humanity and changing the direction of that culture.
Well, you and I have talked many times about the idea of Babel and why that was built in the first place. And that was in the Anatolia region, possibly.
Possibly, yep.
And if it was, then that makes even more sense that all of this is in that region. But I think, and I think you agree with this, is those who survived the flood, that small family and Noah's sons who went out to build their own cities and have their own many, many, many children and grandchildren, populate the world, that some of those who weren't on the ark, hearing the stories and possibly encountering those angels sent to help out post-Babel, wanted to, actually even before Babel, because I think Babel was about bringing back the Watchers.
Yes, I agree.
Hey, let's go back to the old guys.
The old ways.
It was so nice in the old ways when the old gods walked the earth. No, not really.
Golden Age.
Well, that's what they call it in the classic literature. Sadly, that phrase has been labeled for a lot of things.
Right.
Oh, I remember the golden age of television. I remember the golden age of education. I remember the golden age of travel. Whatever. Yeah.
Well, it originates in a pre-flood world where we do not want to return because
we don't.
No, that was we saw how that worked out. It was not a good ending. Only 8 people got out of there
And
alive.
that's why you need to study these things, because you have to learn from history.
Or you're condemned to repeat it. Exactly.
Let's not repeat it.
Let us not. Well, we return now to part 2 of our interview with Drs. Aaron Judkins and Judd Burton and the new book, Decoding Göbekli Tepe. So, Aaron, are you suggesting then that perhaps the theriomorphic depictions, the hybrid, chimeric sorts of entities depicted in the iconography at Göbekli Tepe may reflect what the watchers actually look like?
Well, there's certainly anthropomorphic. I mean, we're seeing the same architectural T-pillars throughout the region, not only Göbekli Tepe, but Hamzon Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Navali Chori, Sefer Tepe, and some other sites. They're T-pillars. Matter of fact, Navali Chori, I think, is where they very first found the T-pillars prior to Göbekli Tepe's discovery. So it's not an isolated phenomenon, but the common architecture throughout the region, again, just the common theme in the design is not isolated at Göbekli Tepe. Again, Navali Chori, Karahan Tepe have very similar architectural features, and you know, this anthropomorphic T-pillar stones. Now, that's not to say that you know, it's at every one of them, but what's interesting is that this ties a commonality into each one of these sites throughout the region. And what I like to do is, you know, I try to take a step back, what I call the 35,000 foot aerial recon version. Now, 35,000 feet, you're not going to be able to see a lot of detail, more probably like around 10,000 feet. But the point is to get a wider view of what's happening in the region. This is what I did with solving the Los Lunas Mystery Stone in New Mexico. I just broadened out and I looked at the region in context and tried to answer some questions. And so this is how I think I solved the Los Lunas Mystery Stone out in New Mexico, which is the ancient Paleo-Hebrew in the New Mexico desert. So I took the same approach with Göbekli Tepe. So I just kind of widened out and just to see what's happening in the region. And this commonality is throughout the region. So what it tells us is that there is a similar ideology for the reason why they're doing that. And Judd said it, it's not because of agriculture, it's a religious ideology that brought them together first in a religious context. So what's that context? It's a Mesopotamian cosmology that we know, one, that they were worshiping the moon god, two, they were venerating ancestors as far back as 2000 BC, which, Derek, you succinctly note in your book, Veneration, that we have an archaeological marker for veneration of the dead. This, of course, this happens now with cultures like in Japan and in South and Central America. They still venerate their ancestors. But the anthropomorphic images that we see are very common. And I think particularly in Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe, the two central pillars that are 18.5 foot tall, these anthropomorphic, which means that they're human-like images, no face, but they do have arms, they have a belt, they're wearing a fox pelt loincloth, certainly is very intriguing. And I think probably perhaps we've identified at least these two in Enclosure D in the book, and I get into the reasons why. But these are, I think, very definitive causes for deification of ancestors and for veneration.
Judd, I know this is something you've studied quite a bit. I've cited you. We cited you in the book Veneration, also in some of our other works, The Second Coming of Saturn, because of the paper that you wrote. In fact, Second Coming of Saturn was the one that was coming out just after you wrote your paper on the origin of the term that I see shows up in your book, Decoding Göbekli Tepe, a number of times, and that is Rephaim. And you trace it back to that same general geographic area that we're talking about here, biblical Anatolia. What connections can we draw? Can we interpret anything about the use of Göbekli Tepe based on this idea of venerating ancestors or venerating especially the deified kings of old, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the general structure of that idea begins in that region. The paper that you're referencing, the War of the Words, was basically a summative linguistic analysis of the word Rephaim and words that were used for king or ruler or chief in Eurasian languages. And many of them I found shared the initial consonant vowel morpheme with Rephaim. So in just the most immediate sense, Rephaim, which is a Hebrew word, is related to words like Rabbah in Sumerian and Akkadian, which means prince or king. But a basic survey of words for king in both directions, spreading out from the Transcaucasus and eastern Turkey, where many linguists place something called the Proto-Indo-European language shift, somewhere between 6 and 4000 BC, basically birthing the major language families that are spoken in Europe and Asia. Words like regal and rey in Spanish and royal in English and Cree and the Gaelic languages and Rolls in Slavic languages and Rajan in Sanskrit and some of the related dialects in Southeast Asia. It occurred to me that because language is the ocean on which culture floats, that this probably speaks to an older bit of cultural engineering on the part of the responsible cultural change agents that we're talking about here tonight. That they imposed this structure of rulership and subjugation on humanity. The Watchers did. They took God's perfect order, his just kingship, and turned it into despotism and tyranny and absolutism. Because if you look at the history of monarchy in the world, most of it falls into that category. And that seemed to me to be little chance that was an accident, that it speaks to the kind of either the actual cultural engineering of those ideas or the manipulation and adaptation to variations of it over space and time. So I can't help but think, particularly because religion is used as a means of subjugation, if indeed we're looking at the Watchers as the agents of change here, that this system, which becomes part and parcel of civilizations, of city-states and empires, this system of rulership is tied directly to not just the linguistic phenomena among humans that historical linguists can chart back to this place, to this region, but it speaks also to the residues of the Watchers and their progeny, the Nephilim and the Rephaim, that continued these ideas and institutions and practices. Speaking
of language, Aaron, I want to get to something that I just thought was fascinating when Sharon and I were reading an early draft of this. And I think we went through it, both of us, during the course of one long flight. We have found that the people called the Luvians of southern Anatolia in ancient times are really fascinating. Their beliefs, as recorded in the Luvian language, have elements of Mesopotamian culture in them, but also you can see how they may have influenced what became the Greek and Roman religions, perhaps as the culture through which Mesopotamian ideas, Hurrian ideas, who were the people who originated in the plains of Ararat and brought the idea that we need to contact the spirits in the netherworld to what became the land of Israel, Canaan. The Luvians appear to be the key to understanding or to decoding Göbekli Tepe. What did you find on these pillars? You mentioned Western Pillar 31 in Enclosure D, Eastern Pillar 18. What iconography there did you see that triggered your interest, and how do you connect it to a literate culture thousands of years later?
Well, the idea is that, I believe this is simply not artistic motifs on the stones at Göbekli Tepe. And when I noticed on both of those anthropomorphic figures, the two central pillars in Enclosure D that are 18.5 feet tall, well, about where the neck would be, there's imagery. We talked about the crescent moon. There's a circle above that, which I think could be a full moon disk. And then right above that is what we would think of as the letter H in English. And then on the other one, Western Pillar 31, you had the imagery of the bull cranium, which is the image of a bull skull with the horns. And to me, that stood out because in one of the other pillars was a logogram that I had recognized as a logogram for Deus, or for God. And I've seen this particular logogram before, and I wasn't quite sure what it was doing on one of these pillars at Göbekli Tepe. And so that got me really searching about what the logogram, the Luvian logogram for Deus, was on the stone. And I think it was, it's on one of the other pillars in another enclosure. But it clearly is the identification for Deus. So when I got to looking at that, that really prompted me to get into what the Luvian logograms were, because I hadn't really studied it at all. I was familiar with the one logogram, Deus, but I didn't really know about any of the other until I started really digging into this. And then when I realized that the Luvians were contemporary, they lived contemporaneously with the Hittites. And so the Hittites adopted, they had two languages, basically. They had a Sumerian language, but they also adopted the Luvian language. And the archaeologists discovered Luvian back in the 1800s, but they misclassified it as hieroglyphic Hittite. And it wasn't until about the 1940s that they realized that they had misidentified it. It's actually Luvian logograms, which more specifically is Anatolian hieroglyphics. Anatolian hieroglyphics are known in this area. I think in 1943 they found Luvian logograms, which are Anatolian hieroglyphics, at Kara Tepe. Now, that's not to be confused with Karahan Tepe. It is Kara Tepe, but they found Luvian logograms at Kara Tepe, I think, in 1943. So this is well documented in the literature. A lot of the logograms have been identified, but there's hundreds that have not been identified. So when I started digging into the literature for Luvian logograms, there's two parts to that. There's silograms, which is based on sound. There's logograms, which is a symbol represents a word. So so the Hittites and the Luvians did this specifically when they're recording on monumental stone structure. You don't have a lot of room to write. You got limited space, and you need to make it count when you write, because you're literally putting it in stone. So so Sumerian's not the language for that, but logograms are, because one logogram symbol can represent a word or an idea. So this is exactly what we see written on the stones at Göbekli Tepe, this Luvian logogram, Anatolian hieroglyphic on these stones. And if that's the case, now, as far as I know, this is a new theory that's been we're coming out with some new theories in the book. One is called the regeneration theory. Two is that there's language on these stones called Luvian logograms. If these are Luvian, then Luvian is not supposed to go that far back in time, some 9,600 years ago. Luvians, like I said earlier, were contemporaneous with the Hittites. So if this is indeed Luvian, it's not simple art motifs; it's language, and the language is telling us something on these stones. And this is what I get into in the book, Decoding Göbekli Tepe.
So yeah, there's about a 7,000 year gap between the time of Göbekli Tepe and the arrival, according to archaeologists, of the first Luvian-speaking people in Anatolia around 2200 BC. Most of their writings that have been recovered date to the, as you say, the contemporaries with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, down to the time of the Exodus. Began to fade from use after the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. But the bottom line is that's about a 1,000-year period where Luvian was used quite frequently. It was, in fact, it was the dominant language in the Hittite Empire after about the time of the Exodus around 1400 BC. But again, how do you account for that 7,000-year difference?
There's a chronology problem here. If it's Luvian, and it's just a theory. It's a hypothesis, and so it's circumstantial. But look, only 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Only 5%, and the 5% has really stayed 5% over the last, I think, 5 to 7 years. The rate really hasn't changed. As a matter of fact, they're slowing down excavations at Göbekli Tepe. And there's some other things going on there with that. But at the current rate of excavations, without slowing down, at the normal pace that they have done, it would take about 150 years to excavate this 20-acre site. So it's very slow. It took about 10 years to excavate Enclosure D alone. So it's very meticulous. It's very difficult because it's not just throwing a bunch of dirt out. I think the German Institute of Archaeology is doing a wonderful job there. It takes a lot of time and effort, as Judd could testify. It's not easy work, and you have to catalog it. And so it's important to do it right. I think they are doing it right. But the point is that more excavations really needs to be done. And I would like to see experts in Luvian, which are not that many experts in Luvian. But I would like to see some experts in Luvian, or even the archaeologists at the German Institute of Archaeology who's digging at the site, to examine this and see if it is Luvian. Because if it is, it really changes the nature of what we know at Göbekli Tepe. So you either have to push that Luvian all the way back, which I don't think you can do, or you have to culturally redate Göbekli Tepe not to the pre-pottery Neolithic Stone Age. That would actually date it culturally to the Bronze Age, which is a vast difference.
It's a huge difference, right? The first Proto-Indo-Europeans from which Luvian descends probably didn't arrive until the Bronze Age in Anatolia. At least that's the current theory. Judd,
but those are the two potentialities that you're left with. We either have to date it younger, or that makes Luvian a rediscovered language.
Okay, or one that was just prominent in that area because there was something special about it.
Well, in Luvian, actually, it was birthed in this area of southwestern Anatolia. This is where the Luvians live. This is right in this area where we find Göbekli Tepe. So it's within the exact region of where we would expect to find Luvian. But according to conventional dating, the Luvians aren't supposed to be at the site. And what makes it interesting is that if this is Stone Age, pre-pottery Neolithic, then you have something that you shouldn't have in a Stone Age society: megalithic architecture, a division of labor, organization, and the ability to do such a monumental feat before the invention of writing, or before the invention of the wheel, or before the invention of pottery. So we have something major going on at Göbekli Tepe. What I like to point out, what Dr. Burton had said about it early on, is the paradigm that's changing the paradigm, because it is. Göbekli Tepe archaeologically turns everything upside down, and it's not agriculture first. It's religious ideology that comes into play first. Then people come together because of this ideology and this cosmology we're talking about in the book, And then you have people that come together, and now they understand that people are actually living at the site of Göbekli Tepe. They found 3 human burials at Göbekli Tepe. So what we know about Göbekli Tepe is changing. We're putting forth some new theories about this.
Again, another fascinating thing, the T-shaped pillars, which are in evidence there at Göbekli Tepe, but some of these other sites around Göbekli Tepe, some of them weigh as much as 20 tons, which again, they moved in an age before the invention of the wheel, but they are clearly anthropomorphic,
Yes.
which they take as evidence of ancestor worship.
And I agree with that.
Yeah.
Because the beetles from which we get the house of God, Beit El, or
Yeah.
Beth El.
That's spelled Betyl.
Yeah,
beetle.
sometimes it's Baety.
Right, right.
But it's the idea of these very simple shapes for the pagan worship, the god, the idol. And sometimes it was just a straight pillar. Then it was a straight pillar with arms. Then sometimes they put a little round head on top. Sometimes they would put genitalia at the bottom. It all varied. And sometimes the guy would be pointing as if he's really proud of what he's got. But those were things you saw over and over again. When we've gone through museums, we see it everywhere.
Right.
This idea of fertility and ancestor worship.
Yep.
That if you do not worship the ancestors, you won't have any crops, you won't have any kids,
Yep.
and you won't have any rain.
Right. And Judd Burton wrote a paper a couple of years ago, which I cited in my book, The Second Coming of Saturn, pointing to the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which is where the mountains of Ararat are located between Turkey and Armenia, as the origin point for the root of words that manifested in many Eurasian languages for royalty, for the old gods, the god kings of old, like Rex or regal or royal or Rephaim, which comes from an Akkadian term, Raba'um, meaning to be great or large, the great ones, in other words. That word, according to Judd, when you trace the archaeology of the word back, the etymology indicates that it came from the Ararat Plain, which is something that you follow a lot, because language.
I love language.
Yeah.
I love following etymology and figure, because if you follow that, think Babel, if you follow the line of language, it'll show you the line of people groups and how they traveled and how they moved from this region to that region. And then you can look and see why they moved.
Yeah.
And it was usually because they needed food.
Yeah.
I love the idea of looking at that Eastern European, just past the mountains of Ararat, to see what may have been the oldest post-flood language groups, beliefs, worship traditions. Did you know? I recently saw a story that a whole lot of dolmens have been discovered in that area.
In the Caspian, the Caucasus Mountains. Yeah, there are quite a few in that region.
Lots of dolmens.
Right.
Big dolmens. Some of them big passage dolmens. So not just your little doorway, it's just almost like a big passage tube. So they really developed into, and it reminds me of Göbekli Tepe, Gilgal Raphaim, in that it allows at a certain time of the year sun to go into a passage and light up a specific area where there was a niche with the votive deity that was to be lit up.
You see that a lot, like at Newgrange in Ireland. So, a lot of this dating back apparently and originating in that part of the world between the Black and Caspian Seas, which again is where the Ark came to rest.
And that same archaeoastronomy has recently been discovered at one of the tepes. I want to say it's Karahan Tepe.
Karahan Tepe. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. So as archaeologists discover more, it just shows that the story, the narrative in the Bible, which is not predominantly, it's not primarily a history book, but the history that's in the Bible is true. And that is why we are bringing this subject to you. Göbekli Tepe, not mentioned in the Bible, but the accounts that we can decipher from the iconography on those T-shaped pillars, the areas around Göbekli Tepe, certainly fits the overall narrative that we read in Scripture. We'll continue our discussion with Aaron Judkins and Judd Burton and tell you how you can get yourself a wonderful GHTV mug when the Bible's Greatest Mysteries continues.
Thousands of years ago, giants walked the earth. They are long gone, but their spirits remain. The evidence is there for those with eyes to see. Megalithic tombs, monuments aligned with the stars, and the words of the prophets and apostles recorded in Scripture. Now, see this evidence for yourself as Derek and Sharon Gilbert take you on a tour of the Holy Land with special guests Pastor Carl Gallups and Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat. From the mountain where the story began to the mountain where it all ends. Wars of the Gods, Volume 2, Search for the Rephaim. Available now in DVD and HD streaming video. Online at gilberthouse.org.
The Bible has answers for many of the mysteries that have confounded humanity since the beginning of time.
That is so true. And we can answer those mysteries from the Bible. So we want to arm your children and grandchildren with the truth. And that's capital T, truth.
Fearless investigations into the most exciting book the world has ever known. The Bible's Greatest Mysteries, hosted by Derek and Sharon Gilbert. Every week, right here.
Welcome back to the Bible's Greatest Mysteries. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I'm Sharon Gilbert, and I'm enjoying some green tea in this lovely mug.
Well, yes, and you can get them yourselves at, get one for yourself, get a whole set at gilberthouse.org/store. These are produced and shipped directly from our friends at Light Hive Creations, Kenny and Gidget, who not only do mugs, they do caps, they do shirts, sweatshirts. There's a GHTV cap.
Yeah, I should wear this. I'm really still sensitive to the light, which is why I'm wearing this hat. But I should have worn that one. You can also get T-shirts.
Oh, yeah, the Red Wing Saga, Sharon's series of supernatural thrillers. We've got PID Radio, which is our podcast that began back in 2005, started this whole journey to where we're doing this now.
20 years.
Yeah.
We've been at this for we're the OGs.
Old geezers.
The original geezers.
That's it.
The old geezers, yeah.
So you can, and what's wonderful about this is that the proceeds, Kenny is a music teacher and a world-class musician. Most of his students are in school, and many of their families, some of them anyway, cannot afford the instruments that they are learning to play. So Kenny and Gidget use the proceeds from the mugs, and not just from our ministry, they also provide them for Skywatch TV. You can get Skywatch TV merchandise now. For Doug Van Dorn, Vicki Joy Anderson, their podcasts. And again, that's where the proceeds go, to give the gift of music to students who are learning from a world-class Christian musician, Kenny C. So you'll find that at gilberthouse.org/store, along with links to where you can get our books available in paperback, and many of them now in Kindle and in Audible format.
Yep, we no longer ship directly from our store. Now everything goes to either Amazon or to Audible, to Kindle, to, if you want to stream some of our travel documentaries, it goes to our streaming site.
gilberthouse.org/video. And for some of the books published by Defender Publishing, there are special offers available, and we will link to those offers as well at the Skywatch TV store, where you can get, for example, very soon, coming up in late March, there will be a special on our new book, The Gates of Hell. So we will put that in the store as well. So the website, gilberthouse.org/store, is still available. It's just that as we're trying to spend more time researching and writing and less time boxing and shipping and carrying things to the post office, we're going to farm that out to other folks to do all of that.
We realize that others do it better.
Absolutely. And quite frankly, with Amazon and with Skywatch TV Store, you can get better prices. So
you can, and frankly, we still get some money from it. So if you're thinking, oh, I can't help them directly, you really can.
Yeah.
Save money yourself. We get a few dollars out of it. That's fine with us.
Yep.
That's not why we write, though.
No, we want the information out there. By the way, to that end, we've got a Substack account out there now.
do?
Yes, and we are releasing articles on Substack on a regular basis. In fact, to get things kind of kicked off, started doing it 5 days a week. and releasing a lot of stuff out there. Got an email the other day from somebody who said, I can't keep up. It's like, well, this is coming from one of my older books, so you could get the book, but it's the fact that we're releasing them and not putting it behind a paywall.
Right.
We're not trying to use the Substack to generate revenue. We're just getting the information out there.
Which is what Tom Horn loved doing.
Tom Horn did that, and that's where we learned it from, because Tom would release almost 90% of a new book, and he would put it out there over the span of 25 or 30 parts in articles. So we are doing that as well, and we'll continue doing that at our Substack site, gilberthouse.substack.com, gilberthouse.substack.com, and get essentially excerpts from our books for free.
Yeah, those are our nonfiction books.
Nonfiction.
Our fiction books are all of them available on Kindle Unlimited.
Yeah.
So if you subscribe to that, you can read them for free.
Yep. So you find those, again, those links will be at our store, gilberthouse.org/store. Very quickly, we're going back to Israel in October, God willing, October 19th through 30th of 2025, optional 3-day extension over to Jordan to go to Petra, the Red Desert of Wadi Rum, see where they filmed Lawrence of Arabia.
Oh, yes. You can even see the little carvings.
Yes, you actually go to one of the sites where Lawrence of Arabia met with the tribes that he was helping to lead against the Ottoman Empire, the
Yeah,
Ottoman
and
Turks.
there's a whole backstory to all of that politically that we'll tell you about if you go with us.
Yeah. Quietly, because some of it is not very politically correct and popular. But anyway, please consider joining us in Israel in October. You'll find information at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. Judd Burton said something that I think you would agree with. Language is the ocean on which culture floats.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I love that, and it's so true.
Yeah.
I love language.
Yes, and that is one of the clues, one of the themes of this week's discussion as we continue talking with Dr. Aaron Judkins and Dr. Judd Burton about decoding Göbekli Tepe. It just occurs to me that the existence, that 7,000 year gap between Göbekli Tepe and the emergence of written Luvian records may be explained if Luvian was a liturgical language. It was preserved because there was something sacred about it. Like Sumerian was preserved long after the fall of the last Sumerian kingdom because it was a religious language.
Well, they did use Luvian as a written, religious, formal language. It was a formal sense of writing. They probably spoke it, but it was used formally on these stones to write. And I think they did it for to record religious or ritual events that they wanted to record in stone. So it was a special way of recording on monumental structures on stone. This is exactly what the purpose of Luvian was. And we actually see the Hittites adopting this into their culture and adopting the Luvian language and these logograms. But look, it's very clear the logogram for Deus is God. Transliterated from there to the Latin is the term Deus, which our English means God. And then when you look at that H symbol in logogram, that H symbol that you see along the belt there, the anthropomorphic images, is the logogram for either gate or for portal.
Oh.
So when you tie all this together, if the symbology is correct in logograms, it's language, and the idea is conferring potentially this could be the gate or the house of the gods, specifically the moon god that has that crescent standard on the anthropomorphic image. So this is very interesting because I think they've deified at least two of these things we talked about earlier, the deification of the moon and the deification of the bull, but they've also identified two others in their ancestry that they consider father ancestors, and that is the deification of Adam and Eve.
Oh, okay. Judd, I want to throw this to you, and I know that we're still just scratching the surface of this, but to keep this at a manageable length, you mentioned one of the new theories, the Luvian connection. What is the regeneration hypothesis that's being put forward for Göbekli Tepe in your book?
Well, I will probably pitch this back to Aaron because he's done the groundwork on a lot of this. But Again, it's all tied into a kind of artificial immortality. I think that that the other side likes to sell the rest of human, and has for all of human history. That with these older ideas of animism and totemism having previously been at Göbekli Tepe, or not just Göbekli Tepe, but the entire Anatolian plateau, those ideas were sort of nascent. But it's not until you see the overlay of a more organized system of religion that it becomes a more cogent religious philosophy.
Well, it's interesting because when you start looking at the iconography here, there's a symbolism that goes back to the idea of worship and revering or venerating the ancestors. And I think this is why you have the anthropomorphic images. Not only that, but you also have anthropomorphic images that are headless, but they have ichthyophallic imagery. And if you're dead, why do you need to portray that? This is, so, and this is just then.
For people who are not familiar with that term, it refers to a male who is sexually aroused.
Phallic image, and you see a lot of this phallic imagery at Göbekli Tepe, but not only there, at Karahan Tepe and other sites, you see a lot of phallic imagery. I think this goes back to the idea of this lost axis mundi, which is this lost connection that they had between the heavens and the earth, between God and people back in the Garden of Eden. We talked about that earlier. But look, when sin happened, entropy gets introduced, sin comes into the earth. It's in Adam and Eve. Now they're clothing themselves. Why? Because they're naked. When God's strolling through the garden and he goes, "Where are you?" He's not wondering where they're at. It's a rhetorical question. What have you done?
Yeah.
It's like when you come to your kids, it's like, hey, where are you at? Where have you? He's making them answer, what have you done? Well, why? And they answer, well, we're hiding. Why are you hiding? Well, because we've done this. And so we see that these anthropomorphic images have belts holding up fox pelt loincloths in front of them. And so why would you need an anthropomorphic image covering your nakedness if there is not anything to that except for the idea of going back to the Old Testament Garden of Eden, where sin comes into play into Adam and Eve? And this is the very idea of this regeneration that we see that's basically have identified a lot of these burial sites that is associated with the deification of Eve, because Eve, the female, in these ancient cultures, was seen as the mystery of creation. Why? Because they had the ability to procreate. Both of them are considered father ancestors, but the female had the ability to give childbirth. And so we see that even in death, when they suffered a physical death, that in their cosmology, they're being regenerated back through the natural birth cycle of life and death. So when the female gives birth, it's the regeneration of the son in particular. It's the regeneration of the son who is then reborn from that ancestor to carry on the line. And then when they die, their parts of their skull fragments, which we see at Göbekli Tepe, are then venerated. So in a secondary type of, after they're buried in a Çatalhöyük, they're buried under the floor of the home. But then we see these skulls are being repatriated back, just the skulls, at the Göbekli Tepe. Why? Is because it's a cycle of regeneration. So when someone dies, is to get them to go back through the regeneration cycle so that from the netherworld, they get reborn into the afterlife as a star god back to the heavens. And this is exactly what they've deified Adam in the sky imagery of the deity An, which is, we see that this imagery An is a Mesopotamian deity, which is the highest of the deities in the pantheon. And we see this imagery is associated with the bull. And so when you have A for father, ancestor, and then you have N and the Sumerian word N, the N is to lift up or to the high or the highest. When you put these together with the father imagery, it becomes the deification of the sky bull N, which I think they've deified Adam as, and then later they've deified also the imagery of Eve. And then we see this throughout later cultures in the imagery of Ishtar and Ashtar worship, the lady. And we get into all this in the book, but it's very interesting because now this regeneration theory is to reattain eternal life that they lost back in the garden.
Judd, again, just to kind of wrap things here, final question, and I'll have you answer this as well, Aaron. Judd, what do you hope people take away from reading Decoding Göbekli Tepe?
Well, I hope that people, well, number one, I hope that it gets people interested in turning to the Bible to walk through, particularly the discoveries in prehistoric and ancient Anatolia that are taking place almost on a weekly basis. I mean, it's a onion that's being peeled back almost weekly. But in particular, since we're focusing on Göbekli Tepe in this month, in this book, I would hope that people would, because it's part of biblical prehistory, because it's in a biblically significant land, that people would consider what role, it had not only in the biblical narrative in general, but more specific things like what were the Watchers doing here? Why would they weaponize a place like this? Why would they pick Anatolia as a place to do it, as opposed to the later homeland of the nation of Israel? So we're hoping to look. We're asking questions too, but we're hoping that we'll prompt some questions from people as they read this, and overall hope that they're edified by it.
Aaron, what do you hope people will take away from the reading of Decoding Göbekli Tepe?
Going back to your very first question at the top of all this, Derek, was why is it important? Why does it matter to the everyday normal Christian? It matters, and I'll preface this with the second answer on this, but it matters because if we can understand the point of origin back in the Old Testament times, back when people were first worshiping these deities through the influence of the Watchers, which we know that's very clear throughout the Scripture, that there's principalities and powers that have influenced. As a matter of fact, we see in the Table of Nations and these 70 nations that were relegated over to the enemy, and God saves himself one, and that is Israel, but he relegates the other 70 to the enemy. And I think this is the very beginning stages of all this. When you run back Ishtar and Ashtar worship, Baal worship, when you see one, you see the other one. They're always tied together. They're always tied together. And I think this is the very beginnings of Baal worship that we're seeing in this part of the world. It all ties because the influence of the Watchers was so prevalent in this area. And this is before the birth of the nation of Israel, before the people become a nation. But look, the powers and the principalities that are influencing the nations that's going to be around them are already being birthed way before. The enemy already knows that he can't stop this, but he can probably slow it down. And so we see that in the very beginnings of the pantheon of deities that are being worshipped at Mesopotamia, this is the influence that's happening to influence actually spiritually the nation of Israel. And so if you can stop that attack, if you can stop that nation from being formed with the entities that are being influenced in this region, then you don't have the nation of Israel. It doesn't exist. And this is why you see the Anakim in the land and the giants also after that in Numbers 13:33, where the children of Israel go in and they see the sons of Anak in the land after the flood. And they're all in there. And then you get the Rephaim and the Nephilim, and you see that that Moses and Abraham, King David nearly got killed fighting some of these guys. Matter of fact, his men pulled him back from one of the last battles, said, hey, you nearly got wiped out in that last battle. We're holding you back. So we see that this influence in the region, it all starts right here in the very beginnings of the Fertile Crescent in this area of Göbekli Tepe.
Absolutely. This is fascinating stuff. The book is Decoding Göbekli Tepe, Biblical Anatolia and the Watchers. The authors, Dr. Aaron Judkins, Dr. Judd Burton. You'll find him online, aaronjudkins.com. And burtonbeyond.net. Gentlemen, thank you for your research. Thank you for your time. And again, thank you for the invitation to write the foreword to the book. I really, my honor to do it. Enjoyed talking with you fellows.
Thank you, Derek, for writing that. We really appreciate it. And thanks for having us on.
This new theory has never been proposed before. And I know that we first heard about it during an early draft of this book that Judd, or rather Aaron Judkins, shared with us.
Plane.
Right. And we were like, did you see this? Did you see?
Plane over to Israel? Where were we going?
We were coming back from Israel, I think.
But we were both reading it. We were just, are you at this part?
Yeah. And it was amazing. The iconographic link between Göbekli Tepe and some of the imagery of the bull crania imagery, bull cranium,
right,
and the Luvian logogram for Deus, meaning God.
Yes.
Luvians were, or Luwians, there's alternate pronunciations.
It's L-U-W.
Yeah. They occupied western and southern Anatolia, what is now Turkey, beginning in the Bronze Age, roughly 2200 or 2000 BC. That's when the language is first attested. Now, bear in mind, that's like 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was buried. So the question is, and how could there be a link between them, the Göbekli Tepe, and the Luwians? And this was something that occurred to me. If Luvian was a liturgical language, it was a religious language, like Sumerian, faded away after the last Sumerian kingdom was destroyed around 2000 BC, just before the time of Abraham. But Sumerian continued as a religious language.
Like Latin.
Like Latin, right. In the old Latin Mass in the Roman Catholic Church.
Liturgical Latin.
Right. So nobody really speaks Latin today, but it is still a liturgical language in some sects within Roman Catholicism. So is it possible that Luwian was actually that old and preserved because it was a religious language that goes back to the days when they worshipped the ancestors at Göbekli Tepe?
I think so.
And the Watchers.
I think so, because if you think about this, when at Babel, they all spoke the same language, right?
Right.
Priests and everybody, they were all speaking the same language, I think. Because otherwise, how can you understand this head guy and this priest guy are telling me I have to do the following?
Yeah.
So you do those things. Well, after Babel, after that event, the Lord broke up the languages, but they would have all had a root in that. There were a few language groups that were vastly different, but you get language language groups that are very, very similar.
Right. Indo-European.
You get a few African languages that are cliques and things like that are vastly different. But for the most part, they're phoneme-based. Phoneme is just a sound you make. And most of them are what we would call consonants and vowels. And so you would have a sound like la that was paired with na, and maybe la na meant something, or la ma meant something. And so they would be very similar. So I can see how you would have, post that, an entire liturgical group, got to keep the secrets, we're the priests, that would be for decades and decades, centuries, millennia.
Yeah. It's fascinating to consider that is possibility. Now, I'd speculated that Babel was probably around 3000 BC, 3100 BC, the end of the Uruk period of history, where all of those languages would have branched out And again, we don't know for sure because writing was post-Babel, so around 2900 BC, the oldest existing examples of written language.
Well, what we call written language.
Yeah, yeah.
But you could say that the drawings, the carvings on the T-shaped pillars is language.
Yeah, a written language.
We
right.
just can't figure out what
And
it
in a
means.
sense, that's what Aaron Judkins thinks he's decoded, and he makes a very compelling case for it in Decoding Göbekli Tepe, connecting the iconography at Göbekli Tepe with later imagery as part of the Luvian written language. Again, 6,000 years later.
And the idea of a horned skull or horned head, the iconography for the watchers or the gods, they all often had sort of cone-shaped heads, but they had bull's horns
Right,
that
right.
wrapped
Multiple sets of
around them.
horns.
And that's how you knew it was a deity.
In Sumerian, right. That was how they depicted the deities. So yeah, it is fascinating that we've got these links when we look at the iconography and keep an open mind instead of just saying, oh, there's no, 6,000 years, there's no way it could have been preserved. Well, yeah, maybe.
Well, think about Kronos.
Right, right. And that is really significant. The depiction of deities in Sumerian as horned or wearing horned hats anyway.
Right.
But Kronos, a name that probably derives from the Semitic word for horns or animal horns, karnu, or in Hebrew, karen. The little horn of Daniel is
Yes.
karen.
Exactly. And that is one of the roots for our modern word crown.
Right. Yes, exactly. So yeah, language can be preserved over the millennia if we follow it back, keep an open mind, and I think Aaron and Judd have published something that will shake up the archaeological world if archaeologists are willing to keep an open mind and not just dismiss it.
I think they have too, and this book is still available at Amazon.
Yep. #1 new release as of this recording in the archaeology category, and well deserved. It is well done, and I was honored to write the foreword for the book because, again, so you see my name on the front cover, which is not why we're promoting it, but it's because we respect these gentlemen. We are honored to call them our friends, and they, like us, share a fascination for digging into and uncovering the Bible's greatest mysteries.
Oh, well done.